Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the Mobile Edge Forum. My name is Peter Cohen. I'm technology editor at RCR Wireless News. And welcome to our first panel of the day. This discussion is entitled Grasping the Opportunity, Are Telcos Ready for the Edge? And joining me today are Babatunde Akindele, Director of Technology Strategy at Verizon. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Neetu Kaushal, Managing Director of Intelligent Edge for Europe at Accenture. Good morning. Good afternoon, actually.
And good afternoon.
And Sharad Sharma, Vice President, Head of Network and B2B Business at NTT Data. Good morning. Good day.
Good afternoon and good morning to everyone.
So we are looking at the hurdles that need to be overcome for mobile edge computing to really come to fruition at scale in this panel discussion, and we want to explore some of the topics on that. So this is something that Prakash Sangam in our previous session touched on, but as a helpful point of reference before we get started, let's define which edge we're talking about here when we talk about mobile edge computing. Neetu, could we start with you? Could you just give me a quick definition of what MEC means?
Sure. I'm going to take one step back and maybe even talk about edge, right? And then we'll link it into MEC, because for Accenture, which I represent, I look after our edge practice across the Europe region. We see edge to be across many spaces. So starting maybe at the device. So there could be a thin client for edge in the device or in a gateway. We see also edge in a premise where there may be a finite or fixed proximity for a customer. And then we see edge in the network. And this is really where we see MEC to flourish and also define how we get to provide edge-based services which are coupled with the network. So for us, where we see MEC to really play a role, it's through a compelling 5G network or a 4G network, a mobile private network. It's about building in edge there. So for us, MEC then extends not just in a multi-tenancy network-based solution, but it could also be coupled with a mobile private network for our enterprise customers as well. So we see MEC in two regards.
Babatunde, Verizon, is doing this in the real world. Does this jibe with your definition? And would you like to build on that?
Yeah, thanks. So it does jive with the definition. I'll just add a few things. So we look at it and we define it in a couple of ways. Yes, edge itself has been defined, right? Bottom line, we're bringing compute closer to the customer at the edge of the network. In some cases, it's far edge, much closer to the customer, and it could also be on premises. So we kind of put it in two buckets. So one, we announced something we call the public MEC, which is really, having some of our cloud partners having that footprint within our network and making it available to be used for mass scale applications and stuffs like that, because you're looking for latencies that are lower, but not microsecond latencies. So that's what we call our public MEC. And then we get to what we call our private MEC, which like Nico defined earlier, is really on the premises, coupled with a 5G, a private 5G network, private LTE network, being able to serve that micro latency that is required for some really safety critical, mission critical use cases. So we look at it from those perspectives as well.
Sharad, how about yourself?
I think most of the things that Neetu and Babatunde has defined quite clearly, but one important thing which I want to highlight in the definition of MEC, typically what we see is it's not just mobile edge computing. We talk about multi-access edge computing now. The world is changing. So, and when you talk to the customers more and more in this space, they always have a question about why mobile, why not Wi-Fi, right? So some things like this come in the conversations. So we talk more about multi-access edge, while definitely there are technologies, mobile technologies playing an important role in bringing data and applications closer to the customer for different use cases.
This actually is a good segue to my next question, because it may seem obvious to some folks, but I want to ask how 5G fits into the edge equation. Not only that, but also Wi-Fi. Let's go around the room again. Nisha, let's start with you.
So I see 5G and edge to go hand in hand together. I know that you also mentioned Wi-Fi there, but I see one to provide a technology for high bandwidth, and then the other to provide low latency. So I see the two to come really close together. And what this means is for the carrier, I see it means enabling the enterprise or the businesses to create services for real-time needs. So what needs to be driven with low latency, as low as maybe even 5 milliseconds. And then what I'm also then thinking about is for the consumer, it also means they could be experiencing brand new experiences that have not really been tabled today. These could be augmented reality or virtual reality based services. So that's really where I see the two technologies to come hand in hand together for both enterprises, carriers, and consumers.
Sharad, would you like to continue that?
Yes, yeah, definitely. In terms of the way we see 5G, 5G is definitely an important aspect into this mobile access edge. So if you think about the different types of deployments that are being talked about or happening in the industry there, 5G, first of all, needs a standalone deployment. A standalone 5G network is required to actually enable the real 5G use cases in the industry. But is that available in the industry today? Are the operators ready with that? No. So that it takes us to this standalone deployment of 5G. So when we deploy the standalone and we deploy it on premises with the edge, then only it makes a real use case. For example, if there's a real-time use case requirement, some actions you need real-time, for example, it's a healthcare kind of a thing, or a autonomous vehicle in the same premises as well. It could be a mining company as well, right? So where you need all these things. So this is where edge plays an important role. Without having an edge with a standalone private network infrastructure, we cannot actually get the benefit of all the 5G use cases that we are kind of looking for. Yes, there are options, there are opportunities without edge as well, but here we are talking about how can we expand. And once you have deployed edge, typically what you see is when you're, if you're an operator, it's a mobile operator, and if you're going to the customer, the what you call the coverage expected is always given. The customer will say, I can have this coverage on DAS. What additional you bring in? So once you deploy a MEC at the customer premises, you have an option, the opportunity to deploy multiple application in the same server, in the same location, rather than having some outside the MEC which needs MEC and some inside MEC. So it is a good deployment that way.
I'm very interested in hearing from you on this, Babatunde, since Verizon is doing this right now with AWS, and I want to frame this by saying that MEC exists in pockets today, right? It isn't ubiquitous. It isn't widespread. What still needs to happen in order to drive that?
Yeah, great. Thanks. So I'll kind of touch on the last question quickly and then get into what needs to happen, right? So Sharad talked about standalone, and I'd like to say, hey, if you think about where we are right now, Verizon in the US, we've started to seed with standalone network, but we have been providing MEC, right? Both public MEC and private MEC even before standalone 5G came out, right? So it depends on the use cases that you're trying to drive and what's the latency requirement for that use case. That determines if non-standalone is fine and you can deploy everything you have. And there are a couple of other factors. But then from a 5G and MEC perspective, they go hand in hand significantly. It doesn't mean you can't do anything with LTE alone. You can still have MEC. But if you're really trying to get that latency that you're looking for, 5G MEC, they're really together. But it's not just a latency issue, right? We're talking about reliability. Reliability is key. When you take an example of an industrial enterprise, right? Reliability is very important. Availability is super important for a lot of processes. We're talking 5 nines, 6 nines. You need private 5G for stuffs like that. And then security is another key issue in there. So with that said, right, what is the offtake? I'll look at in terms of deployment in two ways, right? When you talk about public MEC, we've announced that almost 2 years now. We've made it available in pretty much all. As an example, we have a partnership with AWS where we did that together. We have it available in all the markets in the US, right? So that the capability is out there for public MEC. And private MEC, we've made a lot of announcements on enterprise deployments that we've been able to actually deploy in the US and even internationally. So that is going on. So in terms of deployment, significant progress. In terms of adoption is a different question entirely, because one, like Niku mentioned earlier, for consumer use cases, there are applications that still need to happen. There are changes that needs to happen at the application level. And then you need a widespread utilization of 5G devices. And we're there now in the US. It took a little while, but it's significantly there now. So now you can start to see uptick in utilization. And it's a chicken and egg problem. Developers will make new applications that require 5G, the more users are there using it. Now, on the enterprise side, there are a lot of deployments already, but as you start to see 3GPP release 16 features, ultra reliable, low latency, implemented, now new use cases that require lower latency can be implemented. And those are like the bottlenecks that needs to happen with the device ecosystem, making sure we have those chipsets that can do that. With even on the RAM, the core, making sure all that comes together. Those are some of the things that needs to happen to drive adoption at scale, even though the deployment at the macro level exists already today. Thanks.
Let's turn a little bit to more broad industry trends. Neetu, I'm curious to start with you. Where do you see these things going in the future?
So there's a few things here, right? I really like the way Babatunde framed the MEC in terms of public and private, because we also see it that way, right? And for me, MEC is also about the use case as well. So you could probably divide them by public and private as well. So if we think about maybe the public domain, where we might want to drive smart city services, and you've got connected cars, and you've got V2X services, and you've got cars talking to other cars, or cars talking to infrastructure, lighting, maybe satellite navigation systems, or to make driving experiences much safer, all of these things. So then I see MEC to play a really strong role there. What I then start to see is that use case is really relevant. The technology is there, but I think the integration of it is still very at the early stages, because in Europe in particular, I think the story for North America is a really good and strong one, but in Europe it's still very fragmented. We have different operators, we have different policies around, like Babatunde was saying, around security, reliability, and also with latency. And you know, we see this also as not just a latency topic, but just a data management end-to-end for our customers. So when you start to think about that, then providing something that's a seamless solution feels really hard. So I still think there is a way to go if we think about those types of industry use cases. But then when I think about private MEC, I think this is where our enterprises are flourishing better, because they are ring fencing maybe the proximity of their solutions. There's a particular problem they may be solving in manufacturing, for example. Sharad mentioned mining. So here, where there are going to be some robotics, maybe there may be worker safety solutions using augmented reality. It could be around driving predictive maintenance services, or maybe digital twin services on premise in a manufacturing plant. We see that to be really strong use cases. And in life sciences, what we're also seeing is the development of the lab of the future, just because the ingestion of new information with high resolution images is coming across at a much faster pace now. So how do you then become a much more data-driven and real-time analytics-based business? So we're starting to see some really good green shoots across these spaces. But we see, I'm just going to give you some stats. We did a really nice survey across the manufacturing industry, and we interviewed over 1,500 different execs across the manufacturing space, including a large volume of CEOs, asking them where are they kind of in their digital journey. And it was really interesting to see that only 38% of them had implemented one digital technology solution across their footprint. And this was over the period of 2017 to 2019. So what that shows us is that there's still appetite to do a lot more here. 38% of them still have intention to do a lot more in this space. So I see that this is still going to continue to be a strong area. And if we look at the backdrop of the macroeconomy with inflation going up and energy prices going through the roof, how our consumer goods businesses then also get their goods out to their distributors, out onto shop floors, is another really big area. So we're seeing that MEC deployments in these domains to also be very strong.
Sharad, I see you shaking your head there. Could you, is there something that you'd like to add?
No, definitely Neetu has a very good points in there, which he talked about. The one thing I'm going to add there, a couple of things rather. So one is, if you want to mature this industry, yes, there are stats that the industry they have not gone through this digital transformation journey as we would like them to do. But I think the gap, what we are seeing is the digital maturity of these organizations as well, how mature they are thinking digitally. And in one of the surveys, we noticed that the larger companies, medium to large size companies, they are still onto their digital. They're more digital savvy, I would say. Or there's the other part of the spectrum, which is the SME market, who are digitally born. So these are the two parts of the segment who will go and take this, leverage these technologies of 5G with MEC. There's a middle bit in there as well, who is not really creating, who are not moving towards this digital transformation journey. So, and the reason for that is, one is, of course, the digital savviness, but the other part is about the return on investment. We always talk about, we have hundreds of use cases. I think the industry is now dying with the POC. There are hundreds of POCs we as organizations, we have done with our customers, but whether it is making a good return on investment, the story, in certain cases, yes, and then they are going ahead with. In the other cases, you do the POC and you realize that basically it's not making any sense for the time being, as the time is not there for actually delivering this kind of a solution for them. So, and that also takes to the conversation sometimes about when the operators, the mobile carriers, are working along with the likes of hyperscalers and trying to deploy a wider MEC infrastructure across the country. The question that comes out in the operators conversation is, if I deploy this infrastructure, MEC infrastructure, with the hyperscalers today and create that availability of MEC, what does it bring? How much business does it bring to the operator, to the carrier, by deploying this MEC today, if that is not there? So that's very important to the return on investment side of conversations. So it's not about the infrastructure. That's what I keep saying to our customers as well when they say we want to build the private 5G as a proposition for the industry. I said private 5G is not a proposition; it's a digital transformation, which Neetu was talking about. You have to transform you have to address your problems, or you have to identify the opportunity enabled by MEC or 5G, whatever new technology, infrastructure technology you're talking about.
You know, it occurs to me that the discussion that we're having, it's it's partly about building the technology to make this happen, and also partly about having the use cases, or the customers, the enterprises finding the use cases that make sense for them. But this really can't exist in a vacuum, right? This is an ecosystem that requires collaboration between different partners on the hardware side and on the software side to get everything working right. Babatunde, starting with you, could you give me a sense of what has to happen here in terms of the development of MEC to see that partnership grow?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question because it's not just technology. Technology in of itself is not a solution. We talked about this has to be a digital transformation story, and we need to be able to help the enterprise understand how you take this journey, what you do first, and how you start to derive ROIs versus just a use case approach that may not help you justify deployment of infrastructure that may be expensive. But when you think about what needs to be in place, the stars need to align in terms of on the device level. So anytime I have this conversation with manufacturers or folks in the energy space, the question is always, when do I get the chipsets to even enable the machinery? So the machineries today are probably legacy, or they're 10, 15 years old. Somehow they need to be retrofitted in some way to be able to utilize, consume wireless. They're not there today. So there's either some modules, some dongles somewhere, or some chipsets that need to be on the UE, the user equipment. A lot of the robots on the manufacturing floor today don't have 5G chipsets in them. So all these devices needs to have the capability to utilize this. And then in terms of technology itself, right, really 16 of the 3GPP, ultra reliable latency, time-sensitive networking. These are all capabilities that needs to be available on the core of the network and on the RAN. It's easier if you're talking a private network because, yes, you can kind of make that happen in the local, the core and all that you're deploying on the customer side. So those needs to happen as well. So there are things that the network needs to be able to do, the device ecosystem, the network vendor ecosystem needs to also be able to deploy some things. So when you think about that and you step back and say, okay, how do you now get an enterprise to start to adopt this, right? The use cases also needs to align. And we're not just talking one use case. So if I'm an enterprise and I'm going to spend millions on deploying an infrastructure, I'm not looking for one use case. I need to see a critical mass around a couple of processes that I can then transform to start to derive these values. So a lot of stakeholders need to come in, chime in there. We are trying, at least as a company and some of the other MNOs and other corporations as well, working at the industry level with the 3GPP, with the GSMA, really trying to make sure that we get the ecosystem to move along to where it needs to be so that the value that enterprises need from this can be derived, right? Somebody needs to make sure all the devices can use wireless, and you can take this data into a platform to process it. Someone needs to orchestrate across applications and platforms, across various networks, right? So all those things need to come in place. And that's why I think we're having some of these conversations, because we want to help make sure we're solving the problem for the customers that they need to solve, and they're deriving value from it.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. Does that relegate it to bleeding edge situations, do you think? Where whether it's the CSP or the enterprise or whoever in the value chain here, whoever in the product chain has to take the risk and say, okay, we're going to try this risky thing and see how it works.
So if you asked that question 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I probably would say, yeah, we're in that realm, but we're no longer in that realm. And just to be clear upfront, it depends on which market. I'm talking about the US market, the North American market, because it differs per region. What have we done so far, right? We have decided we're going to make public MEC available to everyone. We have made that move, right? And it's not completely removed from the way we typically lead the industry, right? With 4G, we led the industry. We did it first. You build it, they will come. I mean, do you go to the moon and do everything out there? you provide the infrastructure, because until people can experiment, until they can start to use it, they don't really know exactly how they will derive value. We can help them do that. And then it's the same thing for 5G. So on the one hand, the larger infrastructure has been put in place. Now, what then needs to happen is for each and every one of us, MNOs and stakeholders, to create the ecosystem that is required to help drive broader use cases, right? There's heterogeneous connectivity support that will need to happen, because there are multiple use cases that will happen, as an example, on a factory floor. Then how can I start to enable convergence of IT and OT systems, even over a wired network, leveraging private network on the one hand, and then bringing in some wires. So it's incremental, right? So you don't relegate it to just some nascent use cases, but you start a journey that allows you to stitch a couple of things together over the 5G network to start deriving value. They might get 15, 20% value at that point, but they know that when they get to their North Star, it will be 100% plus value. So let's help you in this journey as you transform to get to that point. It's a gradual process.
So it's like rolling the snowball down the hill and eventually it turns into an avalanche.
Yes, rolling it down the hill, but you're rolling it on multiple fronts. So the avalanche happens way faster than you can imagine in that regard. Plus, there are also business reasons that require the transformation. So it's not a question of, take this technology and use it, right? Enterprises are already trying to drive efficiency. They're trying to drive reconfigurable factories. They're trying to drive a couple of use cases. So while that transformation journey is already going on, we have the required infrastructure, the required network, the required compute to help you drive that value faster, accelerate it beyond where you were thinking.
We've talked a lot about how uneven the distribution of edge computing capabilities are globally, in different regions and so on. By the way, we're getting some great questions from the audience, and we will definitely get to them pretty shortly. But I'd like to go around the room and just kind of ask, the quote that comes to mind is that the future is here. It's just unevenly distributed. I feel like a lot of the discussions that we have with MEC are sort of around that central thesis. How do those regional differences in edge deployments affect the viability of MEC worldwide? Nita, let's start with you.
I would say that enterprises who are global in nature, I think they will have the biggest impact here, because they'll have to have many different considerations from a network operator, different ways of being able to leverage MEC, for example. And also then, what does that mean from like we said already, security, reliability, safety, security, all of those aspects then come into play. So that then varies by country. So I think global clients who generally have a global strategy and which they want to deploy in each of their different physical sites, they're probably the ones who are going to be most impacted. What I would then also say is maybe just another, I guess, lens on this topic. We see MEC to be quite interesting in the fact that for an enterprise, it's generally a consumption of many, many use cases, and the customer is one. So you're solving many problems for one customer. In the kind of B2B2C space, what you'll end up having is one problem you're solving or one use case, but your customers are many. So that's the kind of dynamic that we end up working across in the aspects of MEC. And I think there's something really brilliant here. But then when you talked about having different solutions for different regions, you can already then imagine what does that mean if you're then thinking about it from the lens of the enterprise, or whether you're thinking about it from the kind of experience you're then creating for maybe consumer-based services to increase adoption. So I would probably maybe reflect on those two things, I think it becomes complicated. And for us, it's all about creating those experiences with those values around security, reliability, availability. Those aspects become super important. So yes, still very, very complicated today. And just to give you an example, when we are pulling together solutions for our customers right now, if we need to consider MEC, we don't quite know where does the region start or stop. We might not know if there are holes in the network that we might be operating in. What does federation mean in a space like this? We think about those aspects a lot because it puts off our customers, especially if they see breaks in service. So then we have to go back to our values again and think about availability. So what does that really mean from an availability perspective? So definitely stronger in solutions by country, I would say, where you have a single set of rules. But when you need to start moving outside of regions and zones, that's where it becomes a lot more complicated for our customers.
Sharon, how do issues like data sovereignty come into play here when it comes to MEC deployments internationally?
No, definitely. This data sovereignty is one of the big topics we always hear about. So, for example, I can give you an example. When I was working in one of the Middle Eastern country, having a cloud infrastructure, there was a no because of they want to keep the data in their own country, so they don't want that data to go out. And similarly, this is the conversation about keeping the data in a country, but now we are talking about keeping the data within the premises as well. So there are customers who are looking at the solutions where they can keep their data in their premises. Think about the banks, right? In the banks, they would like to have the data as much as closer to their infrastructure where they are, rather than having it sitting on the cloud infrastructure somewhere. Although there is always a conversation about who can be more secure than a hyperscaler who are managing multiple clients, hundreds of thousands of clients, and they need to be highly secure rather than having some security on your own premises when you build something from scratch. But saying that, this comfort factor as well, beyond the data sovereignty about the other different countries' regulatory aspect, there is a requirement for the customers as well. They would like to keep within their network, within their infrastructure, and that brings in the value of MEC and 5G MEC as well. This is where you bring in the value of building the standalone infrastructure rather than having a public infrastructure and asking your customers to use that public infrastructure. So that and that takes us to the kind of a third way of deploying, which is the hybrid deployment of the network. So hybrid deployment could be where you will be using the public network for certain public use cases and the private for private deployment for the private. And with the new world of 5G, I don't want to go into too much on 5G, but with the slicing capabilities, you can have the same slice running from a public network deployment to be utilized into the private network as well. And that can be made available through the orchestration technology, which Babatunde was also talking about, that are needed going forward. So there is a need for having a proper orchestration capability for different use cases, and not only the use cases, pointed use cases, for the B2B2X2 work as well, which Neetu was talking about earlier. So making sure everything works and the data is kept secured is becoming more and more important in different types of deployment.
Let's turn to the audience questions. During COVID, the manufacturing industry had to accelerate their edge deployments either for AR, MR implementations and operations of their production lines or for other automation. Excuse me. How do CSPs see themselves in stepping up to accelerate the network support? And do they see themselves expanding into MEC as DSPs rather than CSPs? Babatunde?
So thanks. Good question. Manufacturing is one area that we're passionate about and we've been looking at and how to help them. At the end of the day, the key thing here is the customer, right? What is the customer trying to achieve and what is the experience to the customer? And that is front and center for us. And so long as we're able to bring the required compute to that customer, based on, for instance, if the customer is already using AWS, we don't want to force the customer to go somewhere else because we want to play and serve our own MEC. We want to make sure they have that continuity and we make it available. So communication service providers like Verizon and other MNOs, the goal really is to make sure that we provide the compute capability, the MEC, the edge computing capability that the customer needs to help them drive their value. It's not about competition, because if the customer is the most important element here, we want to make sure they get the same experience they need. Otherwise, then they have to work and get the other compute capabilities to work with whatever new stack that I'm providing to them, right? But we want it to be seamless across board. And that's why we're spending time looking into this. The other thing that we've done, just addressing the issue of when you think about the customer being across geographies, is as soon as we kind of figured out the MEC, what we also did was to pull together a couple of stakeholders. So global MNOs to say, okay, how do we make sure we're building MEC to the same standard, the same way, making sure that if that enterprise, that manufacturing enterprise has a couple of factories in the US and a couple in another region of the world, they are able to have the same experience, right? So we pull together what we call the 5G Future Forum that has a couple of MNOs and even cloud providers together working to figure this out. So it's a continuum, right? I think bottom line, we make sure that whatever the use case is, we have the right set of capabilities to meet the customer's needs. We're not seeing this as something where we're fighting against each other. No, it's something where we need to make sure we work with our partners to bring the capabilities that the customer sees as most important, especially in manufacturing, because the edge is just one of it. The private network is one of it. But then how do we make sure you transform that infrastructure itself, the underlying machinery and everything that are required, and the right level of automation is possible within that infrastructure? So that's the way we tend to approach it. And I think that is the way that we'll win going forward. There is room for as many skills as possible, depending on the customer situation and what is needed in order to solve those situations.
I'm interested to know, and Netu, this kind of touches on something that you were talking about before, the role of federation in all this, the role of standards. I believe Babatunde, you were talking a little bit about the sort of rolling 3GPP releases and how they expose new features and functionality that can be used in edge compute. Is this a problem that is only going to be solved through the adoption and use of open standards and those sort of industry collaborations? Let's go around the room. Netu, let's start with you.
Industry standards plays a huge role in how MEC services are going to be rolled out. I know that we're on a journey. The CSPs are working really closely with the telco providers. There's that motion going on. There's also other relationships forming with other members of the ecosystem naturally as well. There's an explosion of devices that are coming through. 5G devices, they're really low right now, right? You don't even get 5G cameras, which are easily available. And a lot of these services are camera-led technology. So what I would probably say is standards is a huge part to play in that for sure. But it's not the only part. I think there are many other aspects where we need businesses to come together to work out common ways that they're going to be developing and rolling out these networks. So if you are one business trying to roll something else like this, I also feel that there's an ecosystem that's forming here where there's cross-functional learning and sharing, because a win for one business will also be a win for many others as well. So I also see outside the standards approach, just which is normal in a way of network build and rollout and strategy. I also see that because edge is a very fragmented technology and still a very emerging technology, but it has a huge value, especially with 75% of workloads to be either created or processed at the edge by 2025. I see, therefore, there to be an ecosystem forming here where we need thought leaders to come together to share their experiences. I think that's also going to be an equal par around the standards.
Sharad, anything to add?
Definitely. So, rightly said, Neetu, standards do have their part, but working as an ecosystem is something is needed in the industry, and that we are seeing that happening in the industry. To be fair, the companies like TM Forum, the groups like TM Forum, and even not that, we are, for example, our NTT group, the Docomo, we have built these ecosystems for taking some technologies such as Open RAN to the next level, where the end-to-end, right from the compute storage platform and right from the semiconductors company, chipset companies are working together along with a cloud operator or an orchestrator company, and everyone, different partners are coming together, and to make sure that the technologies are becoming mature and standardized as much as possible. And not only the deployment side of things, also on the orchestrator side of things. Orchestrate, how can you orchestrate it? How can you create a zero touch kind of an experience? So we have seen that happening in the industry recently, and with multiple players, whether they are even competitors, working together to make some technology becoming real. And that needs to happen more and more, I would say, in the industry, so that we can get the real value out of MEC deployments, or what we're looking for.
I'd like to touch on a couple of other viewer questions before our time expires. This one is specifically directed to Neetu. What, according to you, is the deterrent for CSPs to invest in MEC? Are they aligned with digital transformation in existing ecosystem?
I think they are aligned, but I think here is a cost, right? We're not just talking about integrating compute servers and storage into 5G core networks. We're also thinking about, what does this mean from a data center strategy perspective? How does this increase your overall cost from an energy? What does this mean from a sustainability perspective? What does this also then mean in terms of consumption of new services? How long is it going to take to get your ROI in this arena? I think all of those parts come to play, because I don't feel even today there is a killer use case that drives the consumption through MEC yet. I think it's still coming, and it's very specific by industry vertical, if I can put it that way. So I think understanding what that looks like is really hard to build business cases around. So we're seeing, if we scan across the board, we're seeing a different strategy from AWS, a different one from Azure. GCP have got funding. We don't have clarity on which direction they may be going in long term. So we see here that the appetite is there for sure, but I think building these business cases are very tough, actually. So it's that kind of upfront investment that's really required here to make this happen.
Babatunde, straight from the horse's mouth. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think in addition to what Nitu already shared, so it's a chicken and egg problem, right? MNOs, there are a lot of things going on. There's a macro network that is being deployed, 5G in some cases. There's densification that needs to happen depending on what approach you took to your 5G deployment. So there's so much fighting for the investment. And then the question then becomes, okay, do I pivot and start investing in this? And I'll put it in two buckets, right? So from a public MEC perspective, it's more challenging, because you want to say critical mass and you want to be sure you can monetize at the same time. But I think at the very minimum, from a private MEC perspective, you can start to see that with enterprises. And that's where I think the digital transformation story becomes very important, because it's not just a question of can you adopt MEC? It's a question of how will MEC help to accelerate what you're already thinking or what you already need to do. So I think most MNOs will be able to experiment and move beyond experimentation with private deployment of 5G, LTE, and MEC. And then when it comes to public, I think it's always important for MNOs to think about it from, okay, peradventure, the investment is a lot, but then when you think about the cloud providers already who serve these applications that the consumers are using, for the sake of making sure the consumer gets the best experience, can we also bring them in to have a role here? Because remember, the bulk of these applications are being developed on those platforms already, and it's easier to spin off an instance or an application related to a particular use case. So you will see a little bit of a drag in terms of when things take off. But as there's broader rollout of 5G in most countries and broader rollout of all the different use cases, maybe it starts from some Western countries and then it cascades gradually, you will see the adoption pick up. So it's really going to be a question of, in a particular country, who does it first, right? At some point, when one MNO does it, then the others will try to do it because the consumer experience needs to be uniform across board. So we'll get there. It's difficult, but I think MNOs are already used to building it and having others come. So it's just another leap of faith that is required to start to seed the market with these capabilities.
Well, with that, I'm afraid that we've run out of time, and we've still got some great questions. So, thank you very much to all three of you for joining us today. Thank you for your wonderful insights, and thank you very much for watching.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for watching.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.